The house on Maplewood Avenue seemed perfect to any outsider. Its white picket fence and neatly trimmed hedges framed the image of a quintessential family. Inside lived Paul Reynolds, a respected attorney in his early 50s, his second wife, Melanie, a poised woman with a sharp wit and a magnetic presence, and his son from his first marriage, Ryan, a 23-year-old navigating post-college life. Paul was proud of the life he had rebuilt after the collapse of his first marriage. He had worked hard to restore stability, both financially and emotionally, for Ryan. Meeting Melanie 5 years ago had felt like fate. She brought warmth and light to his world. Or so he thought. Lately, however, Paul noticed a strange tension in the house. Ryan seemed distant, distracted. The easy camaraderie they had once shared now felt forced. Melanie, usually attentive and affectionate, had grown unusually quiet, her smiles not reaching her eyes. Paul chalked it up to stress, Ryan's struggles with career choices and Melanie's recent worries about her aging parents. One evening, Paul returned home earlier than expected from a work conference due to a cancelled meeting. The house was unusually quiet. Melanie had mentioned she would be home all day working on a new charity event, and Ryan, as far as Paul knew, had no plans. Paul walked through the front door and called out. There was no response. He set his briefcase down and moved through the rooms, finally heading upstairs. As he reached the landing, he paused. A muffled laugh drifted from behind the partially closed door of the guest room. It was followed by a low voice, Ryan's. Paul's heart tightened. He felt a surge of irrational panic. What could Ryan and Melanie possibly be doing in there? Shaking off the creeping unease, he reminded himself how absurd he was being. They were probably discussing the charity event. Paul pushed the door open just enough to peek inside. His world tilted. Through the gap, he saw Melanie sitting on the edge of the guest bed, her hand resting on Ryan's shoulder. Their postures were too close, too familiar. The intimacy of their body language was unmistakable. Ryan was laughing softly, looking at Melanie with an expression that was anything but platonic. Paul froze, his mind racing. Was this innocent, or was it something far worse? He couldn't bring himself to confront them, not yet. Quietly, he retreated, shutting the door behind him without being noticed. For the next few days, Paul's mind was consumed by what he had seen. He began to notice other things: the way Ryan and Melanie exchanged glances during dinner, the subtle shifts in Melanie's tone when she spoke to Ryan, the lingering tension in the air. Paul decided he needed proof before taking action. He installed a discreet camera in the guest room, where he had seen them together. If his suspicions were wrong, he would destroy the footage and bury the shame of doubting his family. But if they were right... 3 days later, Paul reviewed the camera footage. What he saw confirmed his worst fears. Melanie and Ryan, in an embrace that shattered every notion of trust Paul had. The betrayal was undeniable, the bond he thought he shared with both of them torn to pieces in an instant. As Paul stared at the screen, his anger gave way to something darker: determination. If they thought they could destroy his family and walk away unscathed, they were sorely mistaken. But as he began to plan his next steps, an old memory surfaced, one he had worked hard to suppress. Paul's own past held secrets, and he realized with chilling clarity that justice was rarely as simple as it seemed. Paul couldn't sleep. The images from the footage haunted him, looping endlessly in his mind. Each second of Melanie and Ryan together felt like another dagger to his heart. Yet, he maintained an outward calm, playing the devoted husband and father while turmoil churned beneath the surface. The next morning, Paul watched Ryan and Melanie at breakfast, his eyes scanning their every movement. Ryan seemed unusually cheerful, joking about plans to meet an old college friend later that day. Melanie smiled, but Paul noticed a faint flush on her cheeks when their eyes met. "Late night?" Paul asked Melanie casually as he buttered his toast. Melanie hesitated for a fraction of a second, just long enough for Paul to catch it. "Not really. Just couldn't sleep," she replied, her voice even. Paul nodded, keeping his expression neutral. He wasn't ready to confront them yet. Not without a plan. After Ryan left, Paul cornered Melanie in the kitchen. He leaned against the counter, studying her intently. "You've been distant lately," he said, his tones soft but probing. "Is everything okay?" Melanie looked up from the sink, her brow furrowing in confusion. Or was it guilt? "I've just been stressed about the fundraiser," she said. "And Ryan's been going through a tough time. I've been trying to be there for him." The words struck Paul like a slap. The audacity of her response left him momentarily speechless. "You've been spending a lot of time with him," Paul said, his voice measured. "I didn't realize you were so close." Melanie stiffened but quickly masked it with a faint smile. "He's your son, Paul. I care about him. That's all." Paul held her gaze for a moment longer, then nodded. "Of course. I'm lucky to have someone who cares so much about my family." Paul needed to know how far this betrayal went. That afternoon, while Melanie was out running errands, he accessed her phone. It wasn't something he had ever done before, but desperate times called for desperate measures. Her texts with Ryan were alarmingly casual, but Paul noticed patterns, inside jokes, and excessive use of emojis, and references to our secret. His stomach churned as he read one message. "Last night was risky, but worth it. Can't wait for the next time." Paul couldn't read anymore. His hands shook as he returned the phone to its place. He realized then that this wasn't a fleeting indiscretion. This was something deeper, more calculated. Later that evening, Paul sat in his home office, staring at the footage once more. Every frame confirmed the truth he didn't want to accept. But there was something else. The way Ryan looked at Melanie, it wasn't just lust. There was an emotional depth, a longing, that made Paul's stomach twist in knots. Had Ryan fallen for her? And worse, had Melanie reciprocated? Paul poured himself a glass of bourbon and stared at his reflection in the office window. His mind raced with possibilities. Confrontation? Divorce? Revenge? None of it seemed enough. He wanted answers, but more than that, he wanted justice. The following day, Paul began to set his plan in motion. He started by calling an old friend, Detective Jack Harris, a retired police officer who now worked as a private investigator. Jack owed Paul a favor from years back, and Paul intended to collect. "I need you to look into something for me," Paul said when Jack arrived at the office. Discreetly. Jack raised an eyebrow. "What's going on, Paul?" Paul hesitated, then handed Jack a USB drive containing the footage. "I need leverage," he said grimly. "And maybe some clarity. Track their movements, find out how long this has been going on. I need the whole picture." Jack studied Paul for a moment, then nodded. "You got it." That night, as Paul lay awake, an old memory surfaced unbidden. Years ago, during the tail end of his first marriage, Paul had been unfaithful. A brief affair with a younger colleague had been the final nail in the coffin of his relationship with Ryan's mother. He had justified it at the time. His wife had grown cold, their marriage had become a formality. But now, he wondered if he had set the stage for the betrayal he was experiencing. Was this karma? Had his actions planted a seed of distrust and disloyalty in his family? Paul shook off the thought, unwilling to dwell on his own mistakes. This wasn't about him. This was about Ryan and Melanie, and the destruction they had wrought on his carefully rebuilt life. The next day, Jack called with an update. "Paul, you might want to sit down for this," he said. "What did you find?" Paul asked, gripping the phone tightly. Jack hesitated. "Ryan's not the only one Melanie's been spending time with." The words hit Paul like a sledgehammer. "What are you talking about?" Jack sighed. "There's another man in the picture. I've got photos. I'll send them over. You need to see this for yourself." Paul's blood ran cold. Another man? His carefully constructed plan for justice was suddenly far more complicated than he had anticipated. Paul sat in his office, staring at the photos Jack had sent him. Each image was a blow to the fragile stability he had clung to. Melanie, the woman he had trusted implicitly, was pictured with another man, an older, polished figure who exuded confidence and wealth. In one photo, she sat across from him at a sleek, upscale restaurant, leaning in with the same warmth and attention she once reserved for Paul. In another, they shared a drink on what appeared to be a hotel balcony. The intimacy was unmistakable. Jack called again. "The guy's name is Richard Calloway. Runs a chain of luxury dealerships. Divorced twice, no kids. This thing with Melanie? It's been going on for at least 6 months." Paul clenched his jaw. 6 months? He repeated, his voice cold. "Yeah. And it's not casual, Paul. They've got a routine. Dinners, trips, he even rented her a condo downtown." The words sent a fresh wave of anger coursing through Paul. The betrayal wasn't just a momentary lapse in judgment. It was a calculated double life. Paul confronted Melanie that evening, testing her with a casual question. "How was your day? Get everything done for the fundraiser?" She smiled, her response smooth and practiced. "Yes, it's all coming together. I'll need to head downtown tomorrow for a meeting with the event coordinator." Paul nodded, masking his rage. "You're doing a great job. I don't know how you manage it all." Her smile widened, but Paul saw the cracks. He could read her now, every forced grin and deflective answer. She was lying, and she thought he was too blind to see it. The next day, Paul took a leave of absence from work, determined to unravel the full extent of the betrayal. He followed Melanie when she left the house, keeping a safe distance as she drove to the downtown condo Jack had mentioned. He watched from his car as she entered the building, her demeanor calm and composed. 30 minutes later she re-emerged, this time arm in arm with Richard Calloway. Paul's hands tightened on the steering wheel as he watched them laugh and exchange what seemed like inside jokes. He felt a surge of disgust, but he stayed put, knowing patience was his greatest weapon. His surveillance was interrupted by a knock on his car window. Startled, Paul turned to see a young woman in her late 20s. She looked vaguely familiar. "Mr. Reynolds?" she asked hesitantly. "Yes," Paul replied cautiously. "I'm Emily," she said, her voice wavering. I need to talk to you. It's about Melanie." Paul invited Emily to a nearby cafe, his curiosity piqued. Over a cup of coffee, Emily explained that she was Richard Calloway's personal assistant. "I've seen Melanie with Richard more times than I can count," Emily began, her expression apologetic. "At first, I didn't think much of it. But then I started noticing things, late-night meetings, trips she claimed were for charity events. I overheard them talking about how she was keeping secrets from you." Paul leaned forward. "Why are you telling me this now?" Emily hesitated, then sighed. "Because I know what it's like to be lied to. Richard cheated on me before we broke up. I don't want you to find out the hard way, like I did." Paul absorbed her words, his anger deepening. He thanked Emily and left the cafe, his mind racing. Paul returned home with a renewed sense of purpose. Melanie's betrayals with both Ryan and Richard were a tangled web, and Paul was determined to tear it apart. That evening, Ryan returned home earlier than usual. Paul decided it was time to test the waters. "Ryan, we need to talk," he said, motioning for his son to sit down. Ryan hesitated but complied, a flicker of unease crossing his face. "What's up?" "I've been thinking a lot about family," Paul began, choosing his words carefully. "About loyalty. About trust. Do you think it's possible to truly forgive someone who's broken your trust?" Ryan's brow furrowed, and he avoided Paul's gaze. "I guess it depends on the situation," he said cautiously. Paul nodded. Interesting answer. He let the silence stretch, watching as Ryan shifted uncomfortably. "Well, I'm glad we can be honest with each other." Ryan muttered something under his breath and excused himself. Paul watched him retreat upstairs, his suspicions confirmed. That night, Paul received a text from Jack. "We need to talk. Found something you need to see ASAP." Paul's heart sank as he read the message. He wondered what new revelation was waiting for him. What else could Melanie and Ryan be hiding? The answer, Paul feared, might destroy more than just his marriage. Paul met Jack at a dimly lit diner just outside of town. The private investigator's face was grave, his usual air of nonchalance replaced by something far more serious. Jack slid an envelope across the table. "You're not going to like this," he said. Paul opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside were more photos and a printed report. The images showed Melanie with Richard Calloway, as expected, but there was something new. One of the photos showed Richard meeting with a much younger man. "Ryan!" Paul's breath caught. "What's this?" Jack leaned forward. "Richard and Ryan have met several times over the past few months. It's not clear why yet, but I dug into Richard's financial records. He's been transferring money to a secondary account that belongs to Ryan." Paul stared at the report, his mind reeling. "Money? For what?" "I don't know," Jack admitted. "But whatever it is, it's not small. We're talking thousands. Regular payments." Paul felt the blood drain from his face. Melanie's betrayal was devastating enough, but now Ryan was involved with Richard in some kind of scheme. The betrayal cut even deeper than he had imagined. That evening, Paul waited for Ryan to return home. When he heard the front door open, he called out, "Ryan, we need to talk. Now." Ryan appeared in the doorway, looking wary. "What's going on?" Paul didn't mince words. "Why is Richard Calloway transferring money to your account?" Ryan froze, his expression shifting from confusion to alarm. "What are you talking about?" "Don't lie to me," Paul snapped, his voice rising. "I know you've been meeting him. I have proof." Ryan's face flushed, and he looked away. "It's not what you think." "Then tell me what it is," Paul demanded. "Because right now, it looks like you're in on something with the man who's been having an affair with my wife." Ryan flinched. "I didn't know about that," he said quietly. "At least, not at first." Paul's stomach twisted. "You knew?" Ryan nodded reluctantly. "I found out a few weeks ago. I confronted Melanie, and she promised it was over. She begged me not to tell you." Paul's anger flared. "And the money? What's your excuse for that?" Ryan hesitated. "I needed help paying off some debts. Richard offered to help." Paul's jaw tightened. "And you accepted? From him? I didn't know he was involved with Melanie when he made the offer." Ryan protested. "By the time I found out, it was too late. I couldn't exactly give the money back." Paul stared at his son, the betrayal settling in like a heavy weight. "You've made a mess of this, Ryan. You've put yourself, and this family, in a position we might not recover from." Ryan's voice broke. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen, Dad. I didn't know what else to do." Paul shook his head, his disappointment cutting deeper than his anger. "You're going to help me fix this," he said. "Whether you like it or not." Paul spent the next few days formulating a strategy. He needed to confront Melanie and Richard, but he also needed leverage. The financial ties between Richard and Ryan gave him an opening, but he wanted to be sure of every angle before making his move. Meanwhile, Ryan agreed to help Paul by feeding him information about Richard. Despite his betrayal, Ryan seemed genuinely remorseful and eager to make amends. "It's not just you, Dad," Ryan confessed one evening. "Richard's been messing with a lot of people. He's not as clean as he looks." Paul raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "Some of the money he gave me came with strings attached," Ryan admitted. "He wanted me to do things for him, deliver messages, pass along documents. I didn't ask questions, but it felt shady." Paul's mind raced. If Richard was involved in something illegal, it could be the key to bringing him down, and exposing Melanie's duplicity in the process. Melanie, oblivious to Paul's growing suspicions, continued her routine as if nothing had changed. She smiled, cooked dinner, and made small talk, all while weaving a web of lies. But Paul noticed the cracks. She was on edge, her phone glued to her side. One evening, as she stepped outside to take a call, Paul followed discreetly, listening from the shadows. "I told you, Paul doesn't suspect a thing," Melanie said, her voice hushed but agitated. "But I can't keep covering for Ryan. If this goes south, it's on you." Paul's blood boiled as he realized she was speaking to Richard. "I'm doing everything I can," Melanie continued. "But we need to wrap this up before Paul starts asking questions." She ended the call and returned inside, unaware that Paul had heard every word. Paul knew the time for action had come. Melanie's lies, Richard's schemes, and Ryan's complicity were all pieces of a puzzle that needed to be dismantled. But as he prepared to confront them, a new question nagged at him: what had he missed? If Richard and Melanie were working together, and Ryan was tangled in their web, what else were they hiding? Jack called with a final update, his tone grim. "Paul, there's something you need to see. Richard's not just involved with Melanie. He's been blackmailing someone close to you. Someone you'd never expect." Paul's heart sank. "Who?" Jack hesitated. "Your ex-wife." Paul gripped the phone tightly, Jack's revelation still echoing in his ears. His ex-wife, Claire, had been out of his life for years, their divorce an acrimonious split that left them both scarred. The idea of her being involved in Richard Calloway's schemes felt like a cruel twist of fate. "What do you mean Richard's been blackmailing her?" Paul demanded, his voice taut. Jack sighed. "It's complicated. I dug into Claire's financial records after noticing some payments Richard's been receiving. Turns out she's been transferring money to a shell company he owns. When I looked deeper, I found records of a lawsuit from years ago, one she settled quietly. Richard's using that against her." Paul sank into his chair, his mind spinning. "What kind of lawsuit?" Jack hesitated. "It was about an accident. A young man was killed in a DUI crash. Claire was the driver." Paul's stomach dropped. He'd had no idea. Claire had never mentioned anything like that during their marriage. "She kept it buried," Jack continued. "Paid the family off and moved on. But Richard got his hands on the settlement details, and now he's squeezing her for cash." Paul's anger deepened. Richard's reach extended further than he'd imagined, weaving into every corner of his life. And now, Claire's secret had become another weapon in his arsenal. Paul drove to Claire's modest home on the outskirts of town. The last time they'd spoken, it had been to discuss Ryan's college tuition. Their conversations were always brief, often bitter. But now, he needed answers. Claire opened the door with a wary expression. "Paul? What are you doing here?" "We need to talk," he said firmly, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Claire crossed her arms, her defensive stance familiar. "About what?" "Richard Calloway," Paul said, watching her closely. The color drained from her face. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't lie to me," Paul snapped. "I know he's been blackmailing you. I know about the accident." Claire's shoulders slumped, the fight draining from her. "How did you find out?" "It doesn't matter," Paul said. "What matters is how we're going to stop him." Claire shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "You don't understand. If this comes out, it'll ruin me. I could lose everything." "You've already lost enough," Paul said, his tone softening. "And so have I. Richard's not just blackmailing you. He's sleeping with my wife and dragging our son into his schemes. We can't let him keep doing this." Claire looked at him, her eyes searching his face. Finally, she nodded. "What do you need me to do?" Paul and Claire spent hours piecing together their respective stories, creating a timeline of Richard's manipulations. Claire provided emails, bank statements, and old correspondence, while Paul shared the information Jack had uncovered. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became that Richard had spent years perfecting his methods. He preyed on vulnerabilities, exploiting secrets and weaknesses for his own gain. "He's a predator," Claire said bitterly. "And he doesn't stop until he gets what he wants." Paul nodded grimly. "Then we need to make sure he doesn't see this coming." Paul returned home late that night to find Ryan waiting in the living room. His son's face was pale, his hands fidgeting nervously. "We need to talk," Ryan said, his voice barely above a whisper. Paul sat down, bracing himself. "What is it now?" Ryan hesitated, then blurted out. "I think Richard's setting me up for something." He's been asking me to deliver these sealed envelopes to people I don't know. He said it was just business, but now I'm starting to think it's illegal. Paul felt a cold knot form in his stomach. What kind of envelopes? I don't know, Ryan admitted. But one of the guys I delivered to, he looked like trouble. And I overheard them talking about a deal going down soon. Paul's jaw tightened. Richard was using Ryan as a pawn in whatever criminal enterprise he was running. You're done working for him, Paul said firmly. No more deliveries, no more contact. Do you understand me? Ryan nodded, his eyes wide with fear. What are we going to do? We're going to make sure Richard pays for everything he's done, Paul said. To you, to me, and to this family. Paul contacted Jack the next morning with a new plan. They would gather enough evidence to expose Richard's criminal activities and cut off his leverage over Claire, Ryan, and Melanie. Jack agreed to follow Richard more closely, tracking his meetings and documenting his transactions. Meanwhile, Paul began preparing for a confrontation that would force Melanie to choose between loyalty and self-preservation. But Paul couldn't shake the feeling that there was still more to uncover. Richard's schemes were too intricate, his motives too calculated. What was he really after? As Paul's plan came together, tensions in the house reached a breaking point. Melanie grew increasingly paranoid, her phone constantly buzzing with messages she refused to share. Ryan avoided her entirely, their once friendly dynamic now strained and awkward. One evening, Paul caught Melanie in the hallway, her face pale and drawn. What's wrong? He asked, feigning concern. She hesitated, then shook her head. It's nothing. Paul stepped closer, his voice low. You don't have to keep lying, Melanie. I know everything. Her eyes widened, her composure slipping. What are you talking about? You, Richard Ryan, Paul said. I know what you've been doing behind my back. And I know how it's going to end. Melanie stared at him, her mask of confidence finally shattering. You don't understand. Oh, I understand perfectly, Paul interrupted. But you're going to explain it to me anyway. And this time, you're not going to lie. Melanie's face turned ashen at Paul's words. For a moment, she looked like a cornered animal, her eyes darting as if seeking an escape. Paul crossed his arms, his stance firm and unyielding. Paul, it's not what you think, she began, her voice trembling. Then enlighten me, Paul replied coldly. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been playing me for a fool. You, Ryan, and Richard. Melanie flinched at the mention of Ryan. This wasn't supposed to happen, she whispered, more to herself than to him. What wasn't supposed to happen? Paul pressed, his patience wearing thin. She hesitated, then sank onto the edge of the bed, her shoulders slumping. Richard, he's been controlling me. Blackmailing me. Paul's anger surged, but he forced himself to remain calm. With what? Melanie buried her face in her hands. A mistake I made years ago, before I met you. I was desperate, and Richard found out. He's been holding it over my head ever since. Paul leaned in, his voice low and dangerous. What mistake? Melanie looked up, her eyes glistening with tears. I embezzled money from a nonprofit I worked for. It was small at first, just enough to cover my debts, but it spiraled out of control. I paid it all back eventually, but Richard found the records. He said if I didn't do what he wanted, he'd expose me. Paul felt a flicker of doubt. Melanie's story, if true, cast her actions in a different light. But it didn't excuse her betrayal, or her involvement with Ryan. And Ryan? Paul asked, his voice laced with accusation. What's your excuse for that? Melanie's eyes widened in horror. Paul, I swear, nothing happened between me and Ryan. Paul's laugh was bitter. Don't insult my intelligence. I saw the way you were with him. I've seen the footage. Melanie shook her head vehemently. He's been confused, lost since college. I tried to help him, to be there for him when you were busy. Maybe I was too close, but it was never that. Paul stared at her, searching for any sign of deception. Her words felt sincere, but his trust in her was already shattered. The next day, Jack called with another update. "Paul, I think we've got him," he said, his voice tinged with excitement. "Richard's been running a money laundering operation through his dealerships. He's using shell companies and offshore accounts to hide the funds." Paul felt a surge of hope. "That's enough to bring him down, isn't it?" "Almost," Jack said. "We need one more piece of evidence, something that ties him directly to the transactions. If we can get him on tape admitting to it, we've got him." Paul nodded. "Leave that to me." Paul arranged a meeting with Richard, using Ryan as the excuse. He claimed Ryan was ready to discuss a new business opportunity, and asked Richard to meet at a neutral location. Richard arrived at the upscale bar, his demeanor confident and smug. "Paul," he greeted, extending a hand. "This is a surprise." Paul forced a polite smile and gestured for him to sit. "Let's cut to the chase, Richard. You've been taking advantage of my family for too long. It ends now." Richard raised an eyebrow, his smirk unwavering. "I have no idea what you're talking about." "Save it," Paul said, his voice steady. "I know about the blackmail. I know about the money laundering. And I know about Melanie." Richard's smirk faltered for a split second before returning. "Big accusations, Paul. I hope you have proof." Paul leaned forward, lowering his voice. "You've underestimated me, Richard. I've got more than enough to bury you. The question is, how far are you willing to go to keep this quiet?" Richard's expression darkened, the arrogance giving way to a cold fury. "Careful, Paul. You don't know who you're dealing with." Paul held his gaze, unflinching. "Neither do you." Unbeknownst to Richard, Paul had slipped a recording device into his pocket before the meeting. As they spoke, he steered the conversation toward Richard's illegal activities, carefully baiting him into revealing more. "You're a smart guy, Richard," Paul said. "But you've made a lot of enemies. How long do you think you can keep all your skeletons in the closet?" Richard chuckled darkly. "Long enough. As long as the people I deal with know their place." "And if they don't?" Paul pressed. Richard's smile turned predatory. "Let's just say I have ways of ensuring their compliance. Fear can be a powerful motivator." Paul's stomach churned, but he kept his expression neutral. "Good to know." The recording Paul obtained was enough to implicate Richard in his laundering schemes and hinted at his blackmail operations. Jack began working with law enforcement to build a case, ensuring every detail was airtight. But Paul knew the battle wasn't over. Richard was a dangerous man, and confronting him directly had only made him more determined to retaliate. Melanie, meanwhile, was on edge, her nerves fraying with each passing day. Ryan avoided both of them, his guilt weighing heavily on him. The house felt like a ticking time bomb, ready to explode at any moment. Late one night, Paul received an anonymous text message. "You're playing a dangerous game, Paul. Back off, or you'll regret it." Paul stared at the message, his jaw tightening. Richard was getting desperate, and desperation made people unpredictable. But Paul wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. Paul couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. After receiving the anonymous text, he began noticing subtle signs. A car idling too long outside his house, shadows shifting in places they shouldn't, and the persistent sense that he was never truly alone. He took precautions, installing additional security cameras around the house and ensuring that Melanie and Ryan were aware of the potential danger. "Who sent the text?" Melanie asked, her voice shaking as she glanced at Paul's phone. "Richard, most likely," Paul replied curtly. Her expression turned fearful. "Paul, he's dangerous. You don't know what he's capable of." Paul's eyes narrowed. "Oh, I'm starting to get a pretty clear picture." Ryan, still reeling from his involvement with Richard, surprised Paul by stepping up. "I want to help," he said one evening as they sat in the dimly lit living room. Paul raised an eyebrow. "You've done enough, Ryan." "I know," Ryan said, his voice heavy with guilt. "But I can fix this. I know how Richard operates. I know his routines. Maybe I can give you something that'll finally take him down." Paul studied his son, weighing the sincerity in his eyes. "Why now?" Ryan hesitated before answering. Because I'm tired of running from my mistakes. And because I owe you that much. Paul nodded slowly. All right. But if you're in, you follow my lead. No risks, no improvising. Deal. Ryan agreed. With Ryan's help, Paul uncovered more details about Richard's operations. Ryan revealed that some of the deliveries he'd made included coded ledgers and burner phones, which Richard used to coordinate with his network. One of the most incriminating pieces of evidence was a document Ryan had found in Richard's office, a list of offshore accounts tied to false names, each one linked to massive transactions. This could be the smoking gun, Paul told Jack after sharing the document. Jack nodded. It's strong, but we'll need to connect it to Richard directly. That means catching him in the act. Paul felt a chill. That means baiting him. Despite her earlier pleas to stay out of it, Melanie found herself drawn into Paul's plan. You're the one he trusts, Paul said during one of their tense late-night conversations. Melanie recoiled. Trusts? Paul, he owns me. That's not trust. It doesn't matter what it is, Paul said sharply. What matters is that he'll listen to you. If you can get him to meet in person, somewhere public, somewhere safe, we can make this work. Melanie hesitated, fear clouding her features. And what happens to me after this? What if he finds out I betrayed him? Paul's expression softened slightly. I won't let that happen. But we have to stop him, Melanie. You know that. After a long pause, she nodded. I'll do it. Melanie arranged a meeting with Richard at an upscale restaurant, using her usual excuse of discussing business matters. Unbeknownst to Richard, Paul and Jack had already alerted law enforcement, who would be stationed nearby to monitor the situation. The plan was simple: get Richard to incriminate himself on tape, using Melanie's questions to steer the conversation. Jack would handle the technical setup, ensuring every word was captured. As Melanie prepared for the meeting, Paul watched her with a mix of emotions. Despite everything, part of him still felt the sting of betrayal, the ache of what they had lost. Are you sure you're ready for this? He asked as she adjusted her coat. She met his gaze, her expression resolute. I don't think I have a choice. Richard arrived at the restaurant, his demeanor as polished and confident as ever. He greeted Melanie with a kiss on the cheek, his charm on full display. You look lovely as always, he said, guiding her to their table. Melanie forced a smile, her palms sweating. Thank you, Richard. I thought we should talk privately. Richard's expression darkened slightly. Something wrong? Melanie hesitated, then leaned in conspiratorially. I've been hearing things, Richard. About your dealings. It's making me nervous. Richard chuckled, his confidence returning. You worry too much, Melanie. Everything's under control. But what about Paul? She pressed, her voice trembling. He's been asking questions. What if he finds out? Richard's eyes narrowed. Paul doesn't scare me. He's too righteous to get his hands dirty. And if he does find out? Well, I've handled worse threats. Melanie pushed further. And the money? The accounts? What if someone traces it back to you? Richard's smirk turned cold. They won't. I've made sure of that. My clients know the rules. If anyone talks, they'll regret it. As Richard spoke, Paul and Jack listened from a surveillance van parked nearby, their headphones picking up every word. Jack gave Paul a grim smile. We've got him. Paul's hands clenched into fists. Not yet. Let's see how far he'll go. Melanie played her part flawlessly, steering the conversation toward the details of Richard's operation. With every word, Richard dug himself deeper, oblivious to the trap closing around him. Finally, Jack gave the signal, and law enforcement moved in. Officers swarmed the restaurant, taking Richard into custody as stunned diners looked on. Richard's eyes met Melanie's as he was led away, his expression a mix of fury and betrayal. You'll regret this, he snarled. Melanie held her ground, her voice steady. Not as much as you will. Richard's arrest sent shockwaves through their community. News of his money laundering operation dominated headlines, and his pristine reputation crumbled overnight. Paul sat in his office, scrolling through the endless stream of articles. Each one brought a grim satisfaction. But as the initial victory sank in, a new wave of questions rose. Richard's arrest was just the beginning. What would come next for his fractured family? Ryan approached him hesitantly. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice uncertain. Paul glanced at his son, seeing the weight of guilt etched on his face. "Now? We pick up the pieces," he said. "But don't think this excuses what you've done, Ryan. You were part of this, whether you meant to be or not." Ryan nodded solemnly. "I know. I'll make it right, Dad. Somehow." Melanie was a shadow of her former self. Though she had helped bring Richard down, the consequences of her actions lingered. She had betrayed Paul, entangled Ryan in her secrets, and jeopardized everything they had built. Paul found her sitting in the living room late one night, staring blankly at the flickering television. "You got what you wanted," she said without looking at him. Paul crossed his arms. "What I wanted was a family I could trust. What I got was a web of lies." Her eyes filled with tears, but Paul felt no sympathy. "You should have told me the truth, Melanie. From the beginning. I was afraid," she admitted. "Afraid you'd leave me. Afraid you'd see me for what I really am." Paul's voice softened, but only slightly. "And what are you, Melanie?" She hesitated, then whispered. "A coward." Paul shook his head. "No, Melanie. A coward wouldn't have helped me take Richard down. But you still have a long way to go before you earn my forgiveness." As law enforcement pieced together Richard's empire, they uncovered the full extent of his crimes. His network stretched further than anyone had realized, implicating politicians, business leaders, and even nonprofit organizations. Ryan's involvement, while minor, didn't go unnoticed. He was called in for questioning, and though he cooperated fully, the experience left him shaken. "I thought I was helping," Ryan confessed to Paul after returning home from the station. "I thought I was finally doing something right." "You were being used," Paul said bluntly. "And you let it happen. This isn't just about Richard, it's about the choices you made. It's time to start taking responsibility." Ryan nodded, tears brimming in his eyes. "I will, Dad. I promise." Amid the chaos, Paul received an unexpected visit from Claire. She arrived unannounced, her face drawn and serious. "I heard about Richard," she said as Paul let her in. Paul nodded. "You're safe now, Claire. He can't blackmail you anymore." Claire hesitated, then reached into her bag and pulled out a folder. "There's something you need to see." Paul opened the folder, his brow furrowing as he scanned its contents. It was a series of financial records, more accounts tied to Richard, but these were under Melanie's name. "She wasn't just a pawn," Claire said quietly. "She was an accomplice." Paul stared at the documents in disbelief. "Are you sure about this?" Claire nodded. "Richard had her doing his dirty work long before he started blackmailing me. She was part of his operation, Paul. Whether she wanted to be or not." Confronting Melanie with the new evidence was one of the hardest things Paul had ever done. She broke down, her defenses crumbling under the weight of her guilt. "I didn't know what I was getting into," she sobbed. "At first, it was just favors, signing papers, moving money around. By the time I realized what was happening, it was too late. He had leverage over me, Paul. He threatened to ruin me." Paul's voice was cold. "And instead of coming to me, you lied. Over and over again." Melanie looked up at him, her eyes pleading. "I didn't know how to fix it. I thought I could make it go away, but it just kept getting worse." Paul shook his head. "You've hurt this family more than Richard ever could. And now, we all have to live with the consequences." Ryan, determined to make amends, took it upon himself to testify against Richard. His cooperation proved invaluable, providing prosecutors with the final pieces they needed to secure a conviction. When the trial ended, Ryan approached Paul with a hesitant smile. "I know I can't undo what I've done, but I hope this is a start." Paul placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "It's a start, Ryan. But rebuilding trust takes time. Don't forget that. In the weeks that followed, it became clear that Paul and Melanie's marriage was beyond repair. She packed her things and moved out, leaving behind a letter of apology. Paul read it in silence, the words a mix of regret and resignation. She admitted her mistakes, expressed her love for him, and wished him a better future. When he finished, he folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. Some wounds, he realized, would never fully heal. With Richard sentenced and Melanie gone, Paul focused on rebuilding his life. He reconnected with Claire, their shared experiences creating a fragile but genuine bond. Ryan, too, began to find his footing, determined to prove himself to his father. Though the house on Maplewood Avenue was quieter now, it no longer felt like a place of betrayal. It was a place of growth, healing, and hope for the future. The house felt hollow without Melanie. Paul had imagined this day many times in the weeks leading up to her departure, but now that it was real, he found himself lost in the silence. Every room carried echoes of their life together, the laughter, the arguments, the quiet moments they once shared. Paul spent most of his days focusing on work, diving into cases with renewed vigor. It was easier to lose himself in the complexities of the law than to confront the emptiness at home. At night, though, the memories crept back, and Paul often found himself sitting alone in the dark, wondering where it had all gone wrong. Ryan, too, felt the absence keenly. His relationship with Melanie had been complicated, part confidant, part betrayer. Now, without her presence, he struggled to reconcile his feelings of guilt and loss. One evening, he approached Paul with an idea. "I've been thinking about going back to school," he said hesitantly. Paul looked up from the case files spread across the kitchen table. "School? For what?" "Finance," Ryan said, his tone earnest. "I want to understand the systems people like Richard use. Maybe even help stop people like him in the future." Paul studied his son for a moment, pride flickering beneath his guarded expression. "That's a noble goal," he said. "But it's not an easy path. Are you ready for that kind of challenge?" Ryan nodded. "I need to do this, Dad. For myself, and for us." Paul placed a hand on Ryan's shoulder, a small gesture that spoke volumes. "Then I'll support you, every step of the way." Claire became an unexpected pillar in Paul's life. Initially, their conversations revolved around Ryan and the fallout from Richard's schemes. But as time passed, their connection deepened, rooted in shared pain and a mutual understanding of the complexity of betrayal. One evening, over coffee at Claire's kitchen table, she asked, "Do you ever think about what might have been? If we hadn't fallen apart?" Paul considered her question, his gaze distant. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But life doesn't give us do-overs. All we can do is learn from the past and try to do better." Claire nodded, her expression wistful. "Maybe we can start by being better for Ryan. He's been through enough." Paul agreed, feeling a tentative sense of hope. Melanie's departure didn't mean she was gone entirely. Her name still came up in conversations, her memory lingering like a shadow over the Reynolds household. One day, Paul received a package in the mail with no return address. Inside was a small box containing a photo album, filled with pictures from their marriage, birthdays, vacations, quiet afternoons in the backyard. Tucked inside was a handwritten note. "Paul, I know I've caused more pain than I can ever make up for. But I wanted you to remember the good times, too. There were moments when I truly believed we had something real, something worth fighting for. I hope you find happiness again. You deserve it. Melanie." Paul closed the album, his heart heavy. Forgiveness would take time, and even then, it might never fully come. But her gesture, small as it was, felt genuine. Richard's trial came to a dramatic conclusion. Thanks to the evidence Paul and Jack had gathered, along with Ryan's testimony, the prosecution secured a conviction on multiple counts of fraud, money laundering, and blackmail. Paul attended the sentencing, watching as Richard stood before the judge, his arrogance replaced by a grim resignation. The judge's voice rang out. "Richard Calloway, you are hereby sentenced to 25 years in federal prison." As Richard was led away, he glanced at Paul, his eyes cold and filled with unspoken threats. But Paul met his gaze without flinching. The battle was over, and Richard had lost. Months passed, and the wounds left by betrayal began to heal. Paul's relationship with Ryan improved as they worked to rebuild the trust that had been broken. Claire became a steady presence, her friendship a source of comfort and stability. One evening, as they shared a quiet dinner, Claire raised her glass. "To new beginnings," she said, her smile warm. Paul clinked his glass against hers. "To better choices," he added with a wry grin. For the first time in a long time, Paul felt a sense of peace. The aftermath of Richard's crimes sent ripples through the community. Former associates were arrested, and nonprofits affected by his schemes worked to rebuild. Ryan, inspired by his own mistakes, volunteered with one such organization, hoping to make amends in a small but meaningful way. Paul watched his son with pride, knowing that while the road ahead would be long, they were finally heading in the right direction. Months turned into a year, and life for Paul began to find a rhythm again. The house on Maplewood Avenue, once a place of secrets and betrayal, had become a sanctuary for healing and reflection. Paul received an unexpected call one evening from Jack. "Paul, I thought you'd want to know, Richard's appealing his conviction." Paul felt a flicker of anger but quickly tempered it. "He's desperate," he said. "He'll say anything to try and claw his way out of this." Jack agreed. "The appeal doesn't stand a chance. But I wanted you to hear it from me first." Paul thanked him and hung up. Richard's shadow still lingered, but its grip on Paul's life was weakening. A year after his decision to return to school, Ryan graduated with a degree in finance. The ceremony was small, but Paul's pride was immeasurable as he watched his son cross the stage to accept his diploma. Afterward, they stood together, the sunlight warm and bright. Ryan handed Paul the diploma with a sheepish smile. "I wouldn't have made it here without you." Paul looked at the certificate, then at his son. "No, Ryan. You did this. You made the choice to turn your life around. I'm proud of you." Ryan's eyes shone with gratitude. "Thanks, Dad. That means everything." Weeks after the graduation, Paul received a letter in the mail from Melanie. Her handwriting was neat, almost too perfect, as if she'd carefully rewritten every word. "Dear Paul, I've spent the past year trying to understand myself, why I made the choices I did, why I hurt the people I loved the most. I don't expect forgiveness, and I won't ask for it. But I wanted you to know that I'm trying to change. I'm in therapy now, working through the damage I've caused and the damage that was done to me. You deserve better, and I hope one day you find the happiness I couldn't give you. Take care of yourself, Paul. And take care of Ryan. Melanie." Paul read the letter twice, then set it aside. He wasn't sure if he could forgive Melanie fully, but knowing she was trying to grow brought a small measure of peace. As the months passed, Paul and Claire's friendship deepened. Their shared experiences created a bond stronger than either had anticipated. One evening, as they sat together on Claire's porch, she turned to him with a thoughtful expression. "You know, I didn't think we'd ever get here," she said softly. Paul chuckled. "Neither did I. But life has a funny way of surprising us." Claire smiled, her eyes warm. "So, what do we do now?" Paul reached for her hand, his touch light but steady. "We take it one day at a time." With Ryan's future bright and his own heart slowly healing, Paul decided to sell the house on Maplewood Avenue. It held too many memories, too much pain. He found a smaller, quieter home nearby, where he could focus on building something new. On the day of the move, Ryan helped him pack the last of the boxes. As they loaded the moving truck, Ryan looked back at the house and said, "It's weird to say goodbye." Paul placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "Sometimes, goodbye is the best thing we can do. It clears the way for a new hello." Ryan nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Thanks for sticking by me, Dad. I'll never forget it." Paul smiled. "Neither will I." As Paul stood in his new home, surrounded by unpacked boxes and the faint scent of fresh paint, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope. The betrayals and heartbreaks of the past had left their scars, but they had also taught him the value of resilience, trust, and the strength of family. And though the road ahead was uncertain, Paul knew one thing for sure: he was ready to move forward, one step at a time.